He's Howard Eibach, former copywriter and creative director and the author of two books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 29 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, we've got a fascinating guest that I was sitting next to on a plane when I was flying from Dallas to Fort Lauderdale. At the same time, I eventually came out to see you. His name is Kevin Lee. He is a content creator and podcast producer. This is a fascinating conversation. And I'm sorry that you couldn't join us, so it's just going to be me solo. But anyway, let's join the conversation. We are back with another episode of the Brief Brothers. I have to say that Henry is tied up and can't join us in this conversation, and I know he's going to regret it because Kevin Lee, our guest, is a fascinating dude, and I really am looking forward to this conversation. Actually, for me, it's a continuation of a conversation that I started with him just a couple of weeks ago. Let me just say that Kevin Lee, our guest, is a content creator. And let me start off by saying, Kevin, before I tell the world any more about you, thanks for joining me on the Brief Brothers. This is going to be fun.
Thank you so much for having me. I got to say, when we were on that flight it was from Dallas to Fort Lauderdale, I believe.
Right.
And that was a 3-hour flight, but it didn't feel like it. We were just going from the time that we started that flight, actually before the flight even took off, to the point that we landed, we had so much to talk about. And it was such a great time. So thank you so much for blessing me with that opportunity.
Well, right back at you, because, usually, and I probably speak for a lot of other business travelers, when I get on a plane, I put my headphones on, I either have a book or a movie, and it's like, don't bother me. Just leave me alone. I want to chill. But from the moment I stepped into the aisle, you were looking for something underneath the chair, and I thought you'd lost something, but you were looking for a power source. And for some reason that triggered a conversation, and we just kept going, like you said, until the end of the flight. And what prompted that conversation and what led me to invite you on this show is the fact that you are doing at a grand scale what Henry and I do on a small scale with this podcast. You're a content creator, you're a podcast producer, you're an entrepreneur, you are a man of many talents, and the conversation just flowed nonstop. And I thought, we got to get you on the show to talk about that. And the reason is that even though Creative Briefs is the starting point for the Brief Brothers, and we like to bring things back to the Creative Brief, even when we're talking to people who don't work directly on the brief, I thought you'd be a valuable addition to our content, to coin a word, because so many of Henry and my friends who we know through LinkedIn and other social media are getting their feet wet in the podcast world. They're starting their own podcasts. They're reaching out and talking to podcasters and being interviewed on podcasts. And I learned so much from you just in our 3-hour conversation about the tools that I'm not taking advantage of. And I have that list.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. You texted me a list of things and I've got them bookmarked. I just haven't dabbled in them yet because I'm working on some other things that you recommended. But let me begin this conversation by going back to where we usually start with all our guests. What got you into this area of this is a creative endeavor. What you're doing is very much in our bailiwick, in our arena, creativity. What got you started? Give us a little bit of a history of your career to where you are today, and then we'll talk more about exactly what you're doing now.
Awesome. Well, I guess the best place to start is when I've always been an entrepreneur. I've always run my own businesses. Even when I was working for other businesses, I was running my own businesses. And one of the things I had discovered really early on is even before the days of Google and really just the wide usage of the internet, you had to find a way to stand out in business and really create a name for yourself. And so it started with creating video interviews where I would just sit in front of the camera and just record answering questions that would be normally asked in an interview, and would send that off to different businesses and stuff and just share insights of like what it is that I offered and how I could help their businesses. That failed almost every time because the production values weren't there, and I just really didn't know what I was doing. And it wasn't until I was midway through my fitness entrepreneurship career being a personal trainer when I started doing workout videos for my clients. And I would just take them through workouts that they would do on their own when they're traveling. And that tended to work really well for them. And it put me in front of the camera enough to get comfortable with being in front of the camera. And then I decided to launch a YouTube channel. And just by being in front of the camera and creating content and being comfortable with being awful in front of the camera, my subscribership grew to the point where I was monetized within about a year. So I went from having 0 subscribers to having 4,000 subscribers. And that got me on the road to making some money. Now, mind you, it was a couple $100 here and there that I would get from YouTube money and Amazon stuff.
Everybody starts somewhere, man.
You got to start somewhere. And so in that process, I got monetized and I was like, this is really cool. And I see a future in this. So I started investing more time, money, and effort into building a content, just a content production. After doing that for a couple of years, I thought maybe it's time to retire from fitness. I'm in the gym from 5 a.m. till 11 o'clock at night because I'm running my business. I'm running this whole team of trainers and coaches, and it was crazy. And I wasn't really seeing my family much. And I thought I could do something else. Let's dive into YouTube a little bit. And that was at 2016. Before I could even fully retire from the fitness space, I got a phone call from someone who runs a fitness company called Escape Fitness. They said, look, we like your work. We're looking for somebody who can help us produce our content. As a matter of fact, we're looking to launch a podcast. I know nothing about podcasts other than it's usually audio, but they wanted to do a video podcast. And I was like, okay, well, let's figure this out. Now, I didn't have the equipment, but I had the willingness to learn and figure it out. And so going from being a full-time personal trainer where my only investment is a t-shirt, shorts, some tennis shoes, maybe a certification every so often, to spending about $40,000 in camera equipment within the first 6 months. I just dropped a credit card and I was like, we'll figure it out. I made my money back eventually, but I learned so much in terms of figuring out multi-camera productions, figuring out how to do multi-camera productions on the go. So all of our podcasts we did wasn't just in a studio where we had the lights set up where the cameras are set up and then all the switchers and all that stuff are set up. It's nothing like that at all. It's completely mobile. So I needed to figure out how to travel with 4 to 5 cameras, a switcher, lighting equipment, audio equipment, the whole nine. And our podcast was produced every single week. So we had to fly all over the world or all over the United States every single week. So we were in a different location all the time, filming these podcasts with these guests who were in the fitness space, who are really big leaders in the industry. So we had to make it look professional. I had to make sure that when I got there on location, that I had 30 to 60 minutes to set up so that the guests and the host could sit down and get going, do their 45 minutes to 90-minute podcast, and then break down within 30, 45 minutes and get out of their space. All of these spaces were completely dynamic. You never knew what you were going to get yourself into. So some spaces were like this, where you have fully controlled lighting, you have shutters, blinds and stuff. And so you can control that lighting. And then some spaces were in mansions, people's mansions, where there's just wide open windows and the lighting's continuously changing and the sound is all over the place. So learning to figure it out as I went along was one of the biggest challenges, but I didn't give up.
Let me stop you right there. Let me stop you there, Ken, because that's a fascinating question. I mean, how did you learn? I mean, talk about
YouTube.
being talk about being thrown into the deep end, the baptism by fire, every imaginable, analogy I can think of, where it's on by the seat of your pants is happening to you in real time. How did you manage? I got to do this. Because I mean, you've heard the old story. I'm learning I'm fixing the plane. I'm building the plane while it's in the air. That's you. How did you do it?
Yeah. I guess I could say there are three answers to that. Number one, I just threw as much money at it as I possibly could. So
I hope you
I was
weren't
already,
telling your wife about this.
I still don't. She finds
you
a
you
new
can't
box from Amazon every week.
you can't let her watch this podcast then.
No, she's already aware. She's already
Okay.
aware.
Okay.
But 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 it's always something. So for her, it's always something new. We've been very fortunate, very blessed that we've been able to officially be debt free because of this work that I do, and because we've really gotten a control on how we manage our budget and how we spend and how we navigate expenses and stuff. But in the early days, I mean, I've been doing this since 2016. So in the early days, every single dollar that went into that I was paid, it was essentially paying the bills, but also paying for equipment and for resources. So we weren't profitable for the first couple of years. Like we broke even all the time. Plus, we also had a really good accountant. I think
That
if
helps.
anything, you have to have a really good accountant.
Good advice.
But so I threw every dollar that I had into it. So if there was something that was lacking in the production where I was like, man, having three cameras is great, but having that fourth camera as a safety camera would be a really good, I'm just going to order it. And that was how I would solve problems on the fly. If sound wasn't on point, I'd be like, okay, let's figure out how I can improve sound as I go along. So of all of my investments, I have I think 8 cameras that I have now in my production kit, but I think I have probably 4 layers of audio that I could work with. So I have your traditional podcast mics like you have right there. I have the wireless lavs like I have right here. I have internal recording wireless lavs, 2 sets of those, and then I have different shotgun mics, boom mics. So and then different recorders. So having different layers of audio solutions on as I go along was really
I
important.
got one of those
That
too.
right there. Yeah, those are absolutely necessary when you don't know what your situation is going to be like. So
Yeah.
everything was so on the fly that I was constantly writing down on a piece of paper like what was the next piece of gear that I would need to take this production to the next level. So the very first podcast I ever produced, it was 3 different cameras from 3 different makers, all battery operated, 3 different tripods. I tried to buy a little motorized slider that was really inexpensive. I really tried to bootstrap everything, and it was easily the worst produced podcast I've ever made. Like I don't even talk about it much anymore because I don't want anybody to ever look at it. But
But let's understand something, Kevin. Most podcasters are like me and Henry. We don't have any cameras. I'm talking into my computer.
right,
I've got a second
which
camera
is
right here, but so what you're talking
which
about is
works
very
perfect.
ambitious. It's very ambitious, and it's
Yes,
going to automatically raise the level of your production values because
100%,
you have so many cameras, and you probably have the lighting and the
100%.
sound to go with it.
But more importantly, it's a one-man operation.
Right, right. And then you said
So
you were started to say that you were learning on the fly, but you were also studying YouTube videos.
yeah, so that's the second part of this. So the first part is throw as much money as I possibly could. Number 2 was solve problems on the fly, write down a list of basically create a wish list of all the things that I would want to make my job easier or make my production better. And then the third thing was constantly watch YouTube tutorials on even just the fundamentals. I discovered early on that it doesn't matter how good your camera equipment is or how good your audio equipment is if you don't really know how to maximize the potential of every piece of hardware that you're using. So when it came to using a camera, you could easily just set it on auto and say, all right, do your thing. But for me, in order to get the cinematic quality or the professional look that I needed to get, you can't just set things on auto and you can't just put a light wherever you want to put it. It has to be all about figuring out your composition, nailing down your lighting, nailing down sound control, lighting control, all those things. So I actually had to watch a lot of YouTube videos on the basic fundamentals of just cinematography. Or I would watch different interviews or interview tutorials and find out how to properly set up lighting, how to properly set up a camera, how to set exposure, how like principles of lighting. So like if you see right now, I have my light set to 45 degrees. It's just out of arm's length. This is a nice big wide light with a grid on it. So it's casting light just on my face, but it's creating what's called a Rembrandt lighting here. So it's got the light here, but a little bit of shadow, a little bit of triangle here. That's called Rembrandt. There's a million different ways that you can light, but understanding
I
how I
like the
wanted
washed
to
out
light.
look.
Yeah, that works great too. Like you have a ring light and it's totally
Yeah,
practical.
you
Now
can see it. Can you see it?
I
In
can.
my glass?
There's nothing wrong with that. Like it works for your
Yeah.
situation. And so every time I would go and run a production, I always wanted my productions to look a certain way and really stand out. Now, this is in the fitness industry space, and no one at that time was really producing podcasts that looked or sounded or had the production quality that we did in our podcast. And the most amazing part was the people that we had on the show were people who founded the Gold's Gyms, the LA Fitnesses, the 24-hour Fitnesses, the UFC gym, and people all over the world who are really big names in the industry who are constantly in front of the camera. So when we did these podcasts, they had never been on a podcast that was produced like this. They always thought that a podcast was going to be an audio podcast because
Right.
the audio podcasts were the thing. And so in the fitness industry, when we launched this podcast, even the CEO's family who ran the company and all the people that were on the board were like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this podcast, spending all this money producing this podcast the way that you're producing it? It doesn't make any sense. If anything, you're losing money doing this. But Matthew had the foresight to say, we're doing this because A, nobody else is doing it. B, the value that we're driving out of this podcast, nobody else is ever going to produce like this, or you're not going to get this kind of value. The information that you're getting it from these guests are all insights that you wouldn't get from anyone else in the industry. So why not do this? And more
Well,
importantly, he
as you
wasn't
said
using this podcast.
as you said on the plane when we were talking, it's more of a like a talk show than a podcast.
Bingo. Yes. And then on top of that, the podcast is a vehicle to build relationships.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, yeah, it cost them about anywhere between $1,100 to $1,500 for each episode. That's not chump change. And that's a big investment.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, but everything is relative. I mean, when you look at the costs of producing a TV spot, that is chump change, right?
Yeah.
Although you're doing it every week or maybe you're doing it every month, whatever the timetable is. And if someone is new to this and it's the space that they hadn't even considered before, it's probably an expense they hadn't considered before. But to me,
Yeah.
when Henry and I do our show, it's nothing. We just, it's our time. We don't spend any money. I mean, I spend a few bucks here and there on some pieces of equipment and for subscriptions to like Podbean and things like that. But it's really just our time. And because we love getting together and just shooting the shit about advertising.
Yeah.
I'm kind of building up to a point here, although I still want you to continue your story because I think where I want to get to, but not quite yet, because I think you're not quite done telling your story. So I'm kind of like hinting at where I'm going with this for our viewers. There are others out there like me and Henry who are either doing this now or want to do it. And I want to pick your brain to get your advice on some of the things that we
Yeah.
can do. But before I do that, I want you to continue your story to tell us how you got to where you are. So keep going.
So 3 years goes by. We've been producing this podcast. We're all over the world. We've pretty much been everywhere you can possibly imagine. Millions of downloads a year, or millions of downloads a month. I don't even know. But the cool part was whenever we would go to any kind of fitness expos or fitness industry related things, Matthew would be he was like a rock star. People would
Matthew,
come up to him and be like, Matthew
tell us,
Janusek,
and he is?
he is the CEO of Escape Fitness, and he is the host of the Escape Your Limits podcast. Sorry, I
Got it.
should have started with that.
It's okay.
And
That's I
and
do
so
have a role here, so that's part of my role.
yeah. And so wherever we would go, especially when it was fitness industry related, he was like a rock star. People would pull him aside and be like, "Hey, can I do a selfie with you? I love your show. I love this episode." And it was really cool. And to be able to be a part of that and to see the impact that we've had on the industry. Now, this is a very niche industry. So
Mhm.
the stuff that we talk about is only connected to the people who would actually listen, of course, and who are in that industry. And so years have gone by, and I also meet somebody by the name of Dennis Yu, who is a digital marketer, really well-known digital marketer, and he taught us a lot about distribution, digital strategy, understanding what to do with the assets that we're creating. So it was one thing to create a good podcast, full-length feature, video and audio podcast, but it was also important to be able to create social pieces out of that and understanding not just what you're creating, but who you're creating for and what kind of messaging and even the strategy that goes behind creating the individual pieces that go into whatever you're going to put out. So everything from the hook, the story, the offer, or the call to action, all those elements needed to be very strategic. You have to be really intentional about it. So I learned about a lot about digital marketing, digital strategy through Dennis when we were producing this podcast. So finished with that. Stopped producing with them in 2020, 2021 during COVID because COVID pretty much shut everything down. And so we weren't
Right.
traveling all over the world anymore. So we had to go with a remote podcast setup. And I think that was definitely a learning experience because now we're not shooting with 7 or 8 cameras. We're not shooting with high-end microphones and all that stuff. Now we're kind of in this situation where it's just a laptop, webcam, podcast microphone. Let's figure it out. Now what ends up happening is, and I think this is going to go really well into the conversation that we're about to have, is now it's not about the visuals. It's about the value-driven content in those podcasts. And people need to know, like, and trust you. And what ended up happening with the Escape Your Limits podcast is that Matthew had to learn to not rely on all the impressive stuff, but it's all about the content that's being driven. So it worked out for the both of us because we learned how to work with a big budget, make really cool looking stuff, and then also be able to make really good value driven stuff and authoritative stuff as well. And it also helped us to learn how to bootstrap this even further, to work in, I guess, more restrictive financial constraints. So you're not going to be working with a $1,000 per episode budget. You're going to be working off of a free 99 budget, which works really well. And for me, now I'm going to be working remotely, so I need to be able to be a good remote producer, which means we have to have the right platforms. Zoom was a really good start for it, but then we got into StreamYard because StreamYard was one of the first available remote podcasting platforms. We used that for a lot of different productions. We got really creative with that. And then Descript comes out later, and that
You told me
changes
about
a
on the
lot of
plane.
things.
Yep.
I think I spent about a good 2 hours of that 3-hour flight talking about Descript because I was so happy in love with Descript. And yeah, just learning all the different technologies out there that made podcasting more accessible and easier to get from recording to distribution in a short amount of time. And I think for a lot of podcasters who wanted to get started during that time, they all followed the same formula, which is use Zoom because everybody's using Zoom, and Zoom was kind of more or less free during the pandemic. So why not use that? And everybody understood Zoom. And all these other platforms coming in later down the line, like the StreamYards, the Riversides, the Stream Labs, those came a little bit later, and they refined the entire process. So now there's plenty of podcast producers that are jumping into the scene who are able to work completely remote, who all they have to do is just send out a link and everything just pretty much works.
Hmm.
But
Well,
it
what you're
always
getting,
comes back to the content.
well, I mean, that's the point that really makes me sit up and take notice, because in our world, in the advertising world and marketing, it's about the idea. All the bells and whistles, well, they come and go. And
Mhm.
marketers and even creatives, the client side and the agency side often fall in love with what's new and shiny. And you've talked about some of the new and shiny things. And what happened was that the pandemic turned our world upside down and made it difficult to take advantage of these high-tech toys that you could use on location or take with you and set up on location, because now everything had to be done remotely. Although I think that's changing. We're getting back. You were obviously back on the road a lot more these days than you were. Pandemic is over. But you haven't lost that central and that key notion that if we don't have good content, I don't care how many bells and whistles you got, no one's going to watch, or they'll watch
Yeah.
once or twice and realize there's no there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and to me, what this comes down to is good branding, which is something else we talked
Absolutely.
about on this flight. We talked
Yeah.
about a lot of stuff. I mean, you joked, we both joked. I said, it's too bad we didn't have the recording, the mics, set up on the plane to record the
Yeah.
conversation. Would have had a little noise issues, but I mean, the content we talked about really was fascinating, and it was what drove me to get you onto our show. So you're now seeing the value, the critical importance of all the technology is great, but we got to have an idea. We've got to have the good content. Talk more about how that evolved and what you do to make sure that you're always focused on what the brand has to offer.
Uh, you heard of Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why?
Yes.
Okay. That is, I think that was a book that really changed my world from a content creator standpoint. Uh, you can always have the idea of what topics you want to talk about, or what, especially if you're a YouTuber, it's easy to talk about, especially in the filmmaking space. It's so easy to talk about gear, talk about equipment. And that's the reason why there's always that new shiny object syndrome, or in our world, gas gear acquisition syndrome. You can easily have new fresh content because there's new products coming out all the time. But if you ran out of sponsors, if you ran out of money and you had no equipment to talk about, no new products to talk about, then what are you going to talk about? And you always have to be clear on what you're personally passionate about, and you got to talk on that and really speak to your why. And that is probably the one core concept I always speak to with brand leaders is understand your why before you start creating content. Because if your why doesn't align with your goals and the content that you create, you're just going to be all over the place. And I think a lot of creators, a lot of brand leaders run into this imposter syndrome because they lose touch with their why, and then they don't know what to talk about, and they just lose track of that, and then lose their audience over time.
What you're talking about is essentially what we are talking about all the time on this, which is we need to have a brief. We need to, a brief is a repository for, the why. Who are we talking
Yep.
to? What's the problem we're trying to solve here with this communication? What's the one thing we're trying to say? What's the one thing that they're going to care? They, meaning the audience, is going to care about. Not what you care about as a company. How do I connect with
Right.
my customer and what they care
Yeah.
about? I mean, too much of what
Yeah.
we see out in the world today is what we call chest beating. How great am I? I'm just this wonderful brand, but it doesn't say anything to the customer that says, you're going to solve my problem. You're going to make my life a little bit easier.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
now you have that conversation, whether it emerges in a document called a brief or not, you still have that conversation with your brand leaders before you commence with the process of putting together a podcast. What's that like? Are some, is it difficult? How do you overcome some of those challenges?
Well, it like I said, it always starts with the brand's why, but then we go into really establishing who their ideal audience is. So their target avatar, their target audience, whatever you want to call it. And it's a matter of finding out what what's their goal, what's their agenda, what problems are they running into, what are the obstacles that get in their way or stop them from moving forward, and what excuses do they make up in their own heads, and what happens. So all the things, like really creating a psychographic and a demographic and all that stuff, really understanding who your audience is going to be, and being able to connect the dots between not just your brand and the audience and your product and the audience, but like what happens after the fact for your audience. If they become customer, where does their customer journey go after that? So really understanding, having a full deep dive, understanding who your target audience is really going to be, and then being able to connect their why with your why, and
How have
making
you,
conversations in that.
how do you, or is that process formalized for you when when you first meet a client? Is it just a
Gosh,
conversation you have? Do
it's
you
so
create a document?
conversational. So one thing that I use, and I think this was one of the key tools that I use that I told you about, which is fireflies.ai.
Uh-huh. Yes, you
Yeah.
did tell me about that.
So
Yep.
so if it's a conversation that I'm going to have over Google Meet or a Zoom call, I always have fireflies.ai in there, and I just have the conversation. I just leave the note taking running from Fireflies, and that's a really good resource for that, because then I could see in real time what they're saying, and I could see real time what I'm asking, and then that way I can use those to bookmark key things that they say. And then even if it wasn't quite clear to me when they said it, I can read it, and that helps a lot too. So all conversations are documented, and that really helps to be able to go back to it later. And also, fireflies.ai will create summaries, overviews, and action items based on those conversations. So
Mm.
yes, that is one tool that I cannot live without, and I wish I had much earlier, because also during podcast sessions, I will leave Fireflies on to record, transcribe, and actually write notes during the podcast sessions. So, for example, we just had a podcast interview actually in Fort Lauderdale. I think it was in West Palm Beach. It was with Stephen Ross. He's the owner of the Miami Dolphins.
Uh-huh.
And so I ran the production, was switching cameras. We were running 5 or 6 cameras there, but I had Fireflies running at the same time, taking everything in. And whenever there were key things that he would say, I would highlight the thing that he would say and bookmark it. And that would be the soundbite that I would use in our upcoming social pieces. So
Fascinating. Yeah,
Fireflies is such a great tool for doing that. So when I do these creative briefs with clients, I use a tool like Fireflies to help me track that conversation and take notes and figure out ways to solve this problem of what content do we need to create? What topics do we need to come up with? How do we connect with this audience? What is the next thing that they need to do when, say, they listen to this and are ready to take action? Because at the end of the day, if we're doing podcasts, we're not doing podcasts necessarily for the sake of podcasting. We're doing podcasts because we're creating digital breadcrumbs so that people can find us, they can learn more about us, they can like us, they can trust us, and eventually want to do business with us.
yeah, exactly. And when we had this in-depth conversation on the plane, and then the follow-up emails and texts to get you, scheduled for this show, I long believed, and we just didn't say it out loud, that there was a creative brief process that you use to get to what you now call the why. Um, there are some people in our industry who think very highly of Simon Sinek and some who don't. So whether that's neither here nor there. I think the central point is we all have to understand what's this thing we're trying to get to, this message we're trying to get to, so we know how to go about communicating it. Let me transition now to what I was getting at before. For the podcasters out there who are just getting started, who have been doing this for a little bit, for a little while, or who are thinking about it, what's some of the key pieces of advice that you would offer, whether it's technology that they need to get or just a mindset? How would you help them get started?
The first place I would start is build a list of all the people that you would ever want to have on your show. Start with that. Start with your bucket list. Could be 100 people, could be 50 people, could be 20 people. Just build out that list and start reaching out to each and every one that you can. And some people are going to be absolutely unrealistic to get a hold of, but you'll find a way eventually. They may be much further down the line, but start with the people that are most accessible to you and just do a Zoom call. Just start there. Get in front of the camera and just start having conversations. And I guarantee your first 100 episodes are going to suck. They're not going to sound good. They're not going to look good, but it's all about repetition. So don't worry about what you look like, what you sound like, whether you stammer or stutter. That's not going to matter when you're really successful after so many episodes. The other thing to this is nobody's going to find you if you're not actually creating. So if you're not actually publishing your content, you're just having conversations. That's perfectly fine. But once you start publishing your content, once you get really consistent and you're frequent with it, you're going to find that people are going to just start discovering you. And all of a sudden they start subscribing and now they're listening. And now you go to your local grocery store and someone will stop you and be like, I love your show. Which could be really jarring at first, but you get used to it. I promise.
Well, I can speak for Henry when I say that we're both waiting for someone to stop us at the grocery store to talk about. We love doing on the Brief Brothers. Our topic is pretty niched, but in our world, I can speak for myself when I go out and I do workshops, and people say we do watch the show. So, but let me back up and say, do you need a little bit more focus besides just my favorite 20 people, 50 people? Because they could all be, I mean, for Henry and me, we do have a focus. We reach out to strategists, we reach out to creatives, we reach out to marketing people. So it's a small world that we're focused on. I mean, I'd love to have a conversation with Brett Favre or Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers, but it has nothing to do with Creative Briefs, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and neither of these guys would come on the show. It's like, who are you? So you do have to have a focus, right?
Yes.
Can you be more haphazard than that?
I think it always goes back to you naturally gravitate towards the things that you're passionate about talking about. So
Mhm.
even if you just had a general idea of what it is that you wanted to talk about on a podcast, I can't tell you how many podcasts I've come across where there's really no core talking point. They just start rambling, just start talking. But once they start doing it, they start to get really clear on things that they're really passionate about talking. Also, if they actually have an audience, the audience gives them feedback on what they're really into, what they're not. And so it's almost like you naturally have this filtering as you go along. You start to discover what your audience is really into and how it aligns with what you're really passionate about. So, for example, I had this couple that for 3 months they just would get every single day. They would just get on Facebook Live. They had this little production set that I had built out for them, and they would just get on camera and just start talking just about whatever they wanted to talk about. And within a really short amount of time, they had people that would actually stay for an entire 90 minutes or 2 hours just chatting with them about the
Calling
most
in.
randomest things, calling in or just commenting on Facebook Live. And then after a while, they started refining the talking points. They started talking more about relationship stuff and marriage stuff and family stuff. And then their audience started to grow as a result of that. So yes, you do have a focus, but even if you're not entirely sure about what that focus is, just get started. Just start doing it, because it'll refine itself over time as long as you're frequently doing it and you're
Right.
consistent. Now, let's say you're a brand leader and you're an expert in a specific area. It's going to be easy for you to want to talk about that.
Right.
And especially
Right.
if your peers are in the same industry, you're going to have plenty to talk about.
Yeah. And
Just like when we were,
well, I was just going to say, Henry and I have been talking about this topic now for 4 years. We have over 200 episodes, so I guess we've crossed that threshold of the first 100 awful episodes. I know the
yes,
first 10 or 20 are pretty bad. We were pretty stiff, and not very comfortable. We've
yeah, we
relaxed a
talked
bit.
about that.
We've relaxed a
Yeah,
bit in the last couple of years, but it's taken us 4 years to get to 200 plus episodes, and we've been pretty faithful about doing it every week. Um, and again, I want those others of my colleagues in our industry who I think have something valuable to say to consider this as an avenue, because
yeah,
I think it's another what I would call a calling card. It used to be you have a business card, then it was write a book or a blog, and that was your way to promote who you were without coming right out and saying hire me. It was you demonstrating what you can do, and I have a lot of professional colleagues who still do that. They have been writing blog posts every day for 10, 15, 20 years. This is another, I think, even more visual and I think powerful tool to
absolutely.
showcase what it is that you do, how you think, your personality, and what you'd be, branding yourself, as you like to say.
Yeah. And another thing to that is, if you're going to host a podcast, it's not you that's going to be talking all the time.
Right.
It's your guests. And there's value in the fact that you're bringing on people who are probably experts in their space, who are very knowledgeable, who have a lot to say about something that might be related to your industry. And what ends up happening is, because they end up on your show, their audience becomes your audience,
Mhm.
and your audience becomes their audience, and you become you get that third party credibility, because you're on this you're on the same session, you're on a podcast with somebody else who has some expertise in their space. So just like we're on this show together today, we're cross promoting.
Yes.
And so being a content creator, you're now going to be, I guess, synonymous with the content creator. And so your audience will be content creators as well. So it's not just you sitting there talking for the next 90 minutes by yourself, eventually running out of things to say. Having other people on your show provides their insights, their opinions, their values, their beliefs, and you're not blowing through a whole lot of energy to create these new episodes, because all you're doing is just bringing somebody on and letting them ramble, like myself.
Well, you're not rambling, but I get your point. And some of our
Yeah.
guests have been very loquacious, and some have been like it was like pulling teeth. And we know you get a mix. What are some of the tools that you would recommend for beginning podcasters? Because you said you spent a good chunk of money, and you are now using some of these online tools, all of which are subscription based, I'm assuming. Zoom is pretty inexpensive. It works pretty well.
Mhm.
And I don't know what the tools are that a lot of my colleagues are using. That's what Henry and I are using. What are some of the beginning level tools that you'd recommend?
Well, let's start with software. Software is going to be the easy one. For podcasting, it's going to be Riverside.fm, which it's pretty much a Zoom, but it's designed specifically for podcasting. It will do everything that you need it to do. So switching camera angles based on who's talking, it'll record each and every person's individual feed and bring that in. So just in case if um, if you wanted to be able to get multiple camera angles, or if you wanted to be able to do a single camera social piece off of one person, then you have all those assets at your disposal. So Riverside FM, that's a subscription base, and I believe it's anywhere between $25 to $30 a month for that. So software-wise, that's absolutely recommended. StreamYard is another one. That was something that was around in the early days, and it only got better. And that's about $25 a month. A lot of these tools are even free to start, so you can just test it out. So there's no long-term investment to try it. So that's really
What
nice.
what's the difference between the first the Riverside and
Riverside
and the
StreamYard?
second one? StreamYard. Are they the same? Are
Yeah.
they different?
They're very similar. I think StreamYard is much more refined, and it's been around for a lot longer. Riverside has more, I think it has more innovative tools to use. But really, you can't go wrong with either one because they really make the whole process really simple. It'll book a session for you. It'll send a link to your guests or your hosts or your producers via email, and it'll schedule it in. And all you have to do is just click on that link, visit it, and it'll put you in the waiting room, just like when you're on a Zoom call or on a Google Meet, and the host will let you in. You have producers who are going to be able to do everything and take notes, but they're not going to be recorded. So it's a really cool and really well thought out system for podcasts remotely. So that's for actual recording
Okay.
and scheduling. For post-production work, I'm a big fan of Descript.
Yeah, we were talking about that, like you said, for 2 hours on the
2
plane. Let's
hours.
talk about Descript. This is kind of like I'm not intentionally trying to be a brand promoter here. We're doing a free episode, but these are the tools that we need to know about, just like everybody's talking about AI and which AI do we, which LLM do we use, which generative AI do we use. These are tools that a potential podcaster or a new podcaster needs to think about. So talk about
Yeah. So for
talk about it some more.
post-production,
Post-production.
for post-production, I'm a big fan of Descript because you can easily pull in, say you just finished your recording session. You take that recording session file, so whether it's audio or video, and you import that to Descript. It's a really quick and simple process, and it will chew up that footage. It'll transcribe the entire thing. It'll ask you who's talking so that it can identify so it can transcribe and actually identify the speakers.
How many
And
can it do? Can it do
then
more than two or three?
it could do way more than 2 or 3 for sure.
Okay. All right. All right.
Yeah. So if like let's say you have a panel of 6 to 8 people, it will ask you, it'll give you a soundbite and it'll ask you who's speaking, and then you just type in the name, and
Got
it'll
it.
just scrub through it and say this person was speaking at this point. So now that you have the transcript, you have the video file, it's all on your timeline. Let's just say you want to kind of move some things around. So in a traditional NLE, nonlinear editor, like Final Cut Pro, Adobe Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, unlike that, you're actually editing based on the transcript. So you can highlight a sentence or a block of text, move that up higher into the transcript, and it'll re-edit the entire piece for you. So let's say you recorded the introduction at the end of the podcast session. You just highlight the entire intro, move that to the top of so copy and paste all the way to the top, and it'll actually re-edit the entire podcast episode so that you have the intro at the beginning instead of at the end.
In seconds rather than, the
In
manual
seconds.
time it takes to do. And because that's what that's what Henry does. And he uses, bless his heart, he uses iMovie, which is Apple's
Yeah.
you know, it's
NLE.
it's very workable, and I've used it myself. It works very well, but I'm sure not as efficient as what you're talking about.
Right.
Or
And
quick.
And here's what it used to look like for me when I would edit full productions. I would do the recording, I'd bring it all back, edit for 2 or 3 hours, look for all the ums and ahs or all the mistakes or all the times that we have to break because there was noise or something that would happen. And it would take a week to edit everything, get the social pieces out, and get the deliverables sent out to the client. Now, with something like Descript, I can move some things around. I could, let's say if I took notes, say at 3 minutes and 33 seconds, we had to stop because there was a dog barking. I can see that note and I can type in the timestamp and it'll show the transcript there, and I could just select it and then delete it, and that's it. Instead of having to scrub through the timeline where there's no reference to any of this stuff, I could even just, I could even see when somebody would say, oh, there's a dog. Just type in search, there's a dog, and it'll find that one section. I could just delete that.
Okay, how does
So,
that amazing feature compare to Firefly?
so Fireflies itself, it's very similar. That's the cool part is Fireflies, all it's going to do is it's going to take notes and it's going to allow for you to timestamp things or bookmark things, but Descript in itself allows you to actually edit
Yeah,
the
so it's
entire
built
video.
that transcript is built into the software and allows you to
Mhm.
see where you are and make whereas Firefly is just something that you can watch in real time. So
It's something you can watch in real time, and it'll do summaries, overviews, notes, and action items. That's just out of box. That's what that does.
so in other words, Firefly is probably more appropriate for real-time recording, and the that feature within Descript is post-production.
I like to look at Fireflies as my note taker and transcriber and co-producer. Where
Okay.
it's listening for those key moments that I can use for social media pieces later down the line.
And when you
So the
say
cool thing
social
is,
media pieces, define what you mean by social media pieces so we were clear on that. I know what you mean, but I
okay,
want you to explain it.
yeah. So not everybody has 60 minutes to listen to key points of a podcast, but people have 30 seconds, 60
Right.
seconds. So you pull these really profound sound bites that are relevant to your brand, and also that are notable mentions that come from the guest or the host. And so you want to look for those viral moments that you can share on social media and then link back to the podcast if they want to listen or watch the whole thing. But the more little breadcrumbs you leave out from your podcast episodes, the more people are going to find you. So those are the social media pieces.
Okay. Yeah, we were talking about that on the plane. Ladies and gentlemen, if you had been sitting next to Kevin and me on the plane, we wouldn't need to be sitting here today, but I'm so glad that you've been able to join us. Is there any last pieces of advice that you'd like to offer to, especially I'm really thinking we're talking to newbies or those who are relatively new to podcasting. What other pieces of advice would you give to those watching?
Don't get too caught up in the gear. There's always going to be fresh new gear out there. And rather than paying full retail value or full retail price for a new camera or a microphone or a computer or a teleprompter or whatever, get it used or even rent. Save yourself the money, save yourself the time, save yourself trying to figure it all out, and spend time with other podcasters who are already doing it, because chances are they've already solved the problems that you're about to run into. So the number one thing is you just want to get started, and you want to eliminate a lot of the barriers to entry early on. So again, get your list of people that you want to talk to, get in front of a webcam, get yourself a nice little microphone. Don't spend a whole lot of money on it, and just start creating. Create and then publish. Create, publish, create, publish. Don't worry about how everything looks. Don't worry about how everything sounds. You'll figure it out as you go along. And at the end of the day, have fun with it.
Kevin Lee, content creator, independent podcast producer, and just an overall great guy, fun to talk to. Thank you so much for joining me on the Brief Brothers. Good stuff, Henry.
Great stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye bye.
Bye bye.